The company Anderson used to be one of the world's top auditing firms, with an all-time high of 90.75 US dollars per share. Anderson was sure to be the market leader at the rate they were going. But by November 2001, their share had plummeted to less than a dollar, losing them millions and millions of dollars in return. So how did this come about? Why did this happen to a company as well known in its field as Anderson? Where did they go wrong? These are the questions that are to be answered on the scandal that started it all. To formally introduce the company, Anderson is the name encompassing Arthur Anderson LLP and other international entities that were members of Anderson Worldwide SC, once the massive umbrella organization overseeing Arthur Anderson & Co. and Anderson Consulting. After being convicted in 2002 of obstructing justice in relation to the Securities Exchange Commission's investigations on Enron Corporation, Arthur Anderson is barred from offering auditing services to publicly traded companies. The company remains in existence to resolve legal problems related to its collapse, a process that is expected to take until the late 2000s to complete.
Arthur Anderson had been the auditors of the Hershey Company.
So how did this come about? Although there was a major concern from the SEC and Congress about conflicting interests, consulting was able to generate the revenues needed to ensure that Arthur Anderson Co. was financially stable. However, there were issues in Anderson's promotional process in regards to consulting. Consultants were being brought in and expected to go through the initial groundwork, just as the accountants had. In addition, promotion to partner was long and uncertain. These factors, among others, led to a large turnover rate for Anderson consultants. They felt no need to stay at Anderson. It was this reason that modifications were made in order to facilitate the consultants. These modifications, while small, started turning Anderson into two very different firms with very different cultures. These growing differences became a much larger issue when consulting began to generate more revenue than auditing. The consulting practice felt they were being held back by accounting and started moving towards autonomy. Finally, in 1989, autonomy was reached and there were now two different business units who acted under an umbrella organization in order for a firm to be viewed as a single unit. There were separate books and all financials were tracked separately. With this separation, the two units now move in very different directions, and Arthur Anderson's audit practice needed to find another way to raise revenue. It was at this time that Arthur Anderson's accounting practice once again tried consulting. They were only able to consult with small businesses in order to satisfy their agreement with Anderson Consulting, who worked with mainly large clients. However, this led to a major shift in the values that made Arthur Anderson's accounting practice what it was. The new value that was on top of their list of values was serving the client. However, this new value had very different meanings in consulting and in accounting. Traditionally, client service for auditors was about ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements. For consultants, client services were about meeting client needs and satisfying the client. Squires 94. And unfortunately, for Arthur Anderson, the view that was dominating decision-making was the consultant's view of client service. This then led to a major conflict of interest that would set Arthur Anderson on a path which would eventually destroy the firm. This conflict of interest was the conflict between protecting the public and generating their client sales. The new focus for Arthur Anderson was now on sales. There was a major shift to younger and more aggressive employees and partners who were responsible for sales. This also led to removal of many of the old conservative partners who were fashioned with the values that Arthur Anderson was formerly built on. As this consulting group began building more client relationships, they focused more and more on their services and less on the obligation of protecting the public. While this new focus was bad for the public, it was very good for sales. It saw revenue increase from under $3 billion to $16 billion in 1988. It was after this that Anderson Consulting decided to separate completely from Arthur Anderson, claiming that they were no longer focusing on small businesses. Clearly, the unified firm that was once Arthur Anderson was completely destroyed, and finally, in 2000, the two businesses units split completely. This growth was fostered by how the firm was set up. Each employee was trained specifically when accepting an offer at Arthur Anderson & Co. This ensured that each and every employee was up to the standards set forth from the beginning by Arthur Andersen himself. This also allowed each office to become self-sufficient and allowed them to facilitate all the client's needs, whether it was accounting, audit, or tax. However, these firms were always to act as a single firm, sending a unified message. Arthur Andersen had been on a downward spiral in regards to their ethics. They had completely strayed from the values that the firm was built on. They now did whatever it took to raise profits and would not dare question the management behind it. This was the case for Waste Management Inc. In June of that year, the SEC found that the Anderson's audit reports were materially false and misleading for the years between 1992 and 1996 and that the firm engaged in improper professional conduct. Squires 121. Arthur Andersen had violated the public duty they had, which was to ensure that these companies were engaged in sound financial activities. This was due to the new values that had taken root in the firm, which was to make as much profit as possible. These new values were clearly seen when looking at the revenues generated from Waste Management Inc. The fees collected from Arthur Andersen for their auditing practices were $7.5 million, while the consulting fees collected were $11.8 million. There was a clear conflict of interest and lack of focus on protecting the public. The issue came to its climax when dealing with Enron, which was one of the largest financial scandals in the United States and was a death sentence for Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen provided auditing service for Enron and contributed to do so even when advised not to. There were glaring conflicts of interest, and yet Arthur Andersen continued to approve deals for Enron. There were multiple instances where the professional standards group of Arthur Andersen advised against deals presented by Enron. However, these cautions were ignored and the deals were passed. David Duncan was a partner responsible for the Enron account and consistently ignored the cautions that were presented to him. He was focused on the client and the client only. The duty to protect the public had been forgotten. The focus was clearly on the client when looking at Enron and the revenue it was going to bring in. Enron was one of the firm's largest clients, and this was a gigantic engagement expected to be worth as much as $100 million in revenue. Squires 126. It was this figure in mind that led the decision-making at Arthur Andersen and not the responsibility they had to the public.